Du lyssnar på Lifecoach-podden, avsnitt 162, där jag har Shawna Samuel på besök och vi pratar om the motherhood penalty. Välkommen till Lifecoach-podden, där allt handlar om tankar, känslor och hur vi kan använda dem för att komma dit vi vill. Jag är din guide, författare, projektstartare och certifierad lifecoach, Anna Wallner. Men hej hallå! Idag har jag någonting extra till er här på podden. För jag har nämligen med mig Shawna Samuel. Och ni kanske känner igen henne för att hon var med i avsnitt 111 där vi pratade om sömn. Och där kom jag faktiskt ihåg att be henne presentera sig innan vi satte igång. Vilket jag fullkomligt glömde bort den här gången. För jag var så exalterad över att ha henne med. Men jag kan säga som presentation av Shawna att hon är amerikan, men hon bor numera i Paris. Hon hjälper kvinnor att balansera och hantera krävande karriärer och familjeliv. Och det gör hon genom någonting hon kallar för the mental offload. Och det heter även hennes podcast och den är så himla bra. Och du kommer höra vilken fantastisk podcaströst Shawna har. Jag älskar hennes podcast. Inte bara på grund av det, utan även på grund av allt fantastiskt innehåll. Så den kan jag verkligen varmt rekommendera. Så idag så har jag som sagt henne med och vi kommer prata om the motherhood penalty som faktiskt är på riktigt. Och Shawna har all statistik för att bevisa det. Men sen kommer vi också prata om hur den här bestraffningen också spiller över i någonting som Shawna kallar för mom guilt. Så har du barn så känner du säkert helt igen dig. Och hur de här två samverkar för att skapa utbrändhet i våra liv. Och jag vet att den här podden är lite längre än vanligt. Ungefär dubbelt så lång skulle jag säga. Jag tror vi pratar i 40 minuter. Men jag kan verkligen rekommendera att hålla ut till slutet. För Shawna har några riktiga bra tips. Och på slutet så kan du också få höra Shawna berätta lite mer om sitt nya program och vad hon har på gång på sitt håll. Och det vill du faktiskt inte missa. Så nu ska jag inte dra ut på det här ännu mer eftersom podcastavsnittet redan är ganska långt. Så jag lämnar bara över till vårat samtal. Hi Shawna, I am so happy that you're back on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm thrilled to be back.
Well, for all the listeners, me and Shawna, we had a discussion the other day, and because we are colleagues, I can mention, and we started to talk about the motherhood penalty. And I just thought it would be so good if Shawna could come on the podcast and talk about it to all of you, because she is such an expert on this subject. And if you haven't, I want to mention this first before we jump into our conversation. But if you haven't listened to Shawna's podcast, The Mental Offload, I highly recommend it. It is so good. So now we've mentioned that. I didn't want to forget. But do you remember what we talked about last time you were on the podcast?
Oh, we had such a good conversation last time on the podcast all about sleep. I truly believe sleep is the next feminist frontier. And we got really deep into sleep in the last podcast episode we did together.
Yeah, that was really, really good. And
So
it's
fun.
number 111 if anybody wants to go and check that out. And just connecting back to that before we get started, you just told me before I started to record that there is some new research.
Yes, indeed. I don't have the reference right here in front of me, but I've heard that there has recently been a sleep study done on women because a lot of the research done on sleep was done primarily on men, like a lot of research in the sciences. So they actually did some sleep studies on women. And what they found is that women need more than 8 hours of sleep a night Typically, I think on average, most women need about 9 hours of sleep a night. And that changes with your menstrual cycle. You might even need an hour more at certain points in your cycle. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Oh, and that feels so good to hear. I've been so tired, even though I sleep 7+ hours, and I've thought it must be something wrong with me, but clearly there isn't, says
I
science
know,
now.
right? Yes. Science backed. I'm like, this is why I
Science is
need nine
backing
hours a
me.
night.
Yeah, so good. But today's topic, anyway, that we are going to discuss is the motherhood penalty. And you have to explain this to us. But I think when we just say the motherhood penalty, a lot of us instantly know what, yes, there is something going on there. When you get children, your life changes. Or how would
Absolutely.
you explain it like more in depth?
Yeah. Well, I am fascinated by this topic. Maybe fascinated is the wrong word because it has a sort of positive connotation to it, but I'm fascinated and appalled by the research that's been done on the motherhood penalty. And maybe just to take a step back, one of the reasons why I do so much work in this area is that I tend to work um, almost exclusively with women who are mothers who are trying to hold down really demanding jobs as well as you know provide a great family life. And one of the phenomena that come up that we're up against in the workforce is this thing called the motherhood penalty. Now, almost everyone is probably aware of the gender pay gap. Women working full time do not earn typically the same amount as men in the paid workforce. So in the US, this works out to be on average, women working full time earn about 84 cents to every dollar earned by men in the workforce. In Sweden, that pay gap between men and women is more like 14%. So women on average earn 86 kroner to every 100 by men. And that comes from data from the OECD. On the face of it, that already sounds bad, right? We know we've got this gender pay gap. But what's fascinating and appalling is that that gap is higher for women with kids. In Sweden, it goes from 14% gap to 21% gap
What?
for women with kids.
You're joking. I'm sorry, but I am not a statistic person. That's why I'm so glad that you're here. I had no idea.
Yes, it's huge. And this is what is really known as the motherhood penalty. Kind of big picture, it's this phenomenon where women's careers and pay stagnates or even declines once she has children. And it's maddening and it's happening across almost every country. The phenomenon that once women have kids, their careers tend to fall off the cliff and the pay goes with it. And we see it in the numbers, we see it in the data.
But isn't I've heard that when it comes to men, being a dad is something positive, so it can even boost men's careers, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, this is the flip side of the motherhood penalty, where women are getting penalized at work when they have children. Men tend to get what's called the fatherhood bonus.
Oh,
So when men have kids, they are seen as being family men, providers, more committed to their success at work. They tend to get a bump in pay. On average, in the data that I've seen, which again, a lot of this comes from the US, so it's not Sweden specific or Europe specific, that fatherhood bonus is about 6% on average. Women, however, are seen as less committed and less capable once they have kids. And their pay, their promotions, their opportunities start to hit a wall.
but I'm thinking that must be related to the fact that everybody knows that by tradition, women start to do the second shift when they come home. So I'm thinking, I'm not saying that employees think this or actually go like, oh, I'll pay her less because she will be less active at work or anything like that. But who takes normally, I'm generalizing, of course, but normally the logistics, the second shift, when the kids are sick, wh- who takes that? Well, normally it's the mother, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so this is, I think you hit on a really important point, which is that a lot of times there are these unconscious biases that our leaders, the people around us are taking on. You notice it in little comments that
Mm,
tend to get made to women or about women. Like, oh, well, do you think she'll come back after she has the baby?
mm,
Maybe she'll want to, just stay home and really be there full time with her kids. Or, when she comes back to work, it can be like, oh, do you think she's really going to be available to travel? Maybe we should put Joe on that project instead of Jenny, right?
mm.
So it comes out in these subtle assumptions and comments, but underlying it is this kind of bias about where women are spending their time, where they want to spend their time and effort, and also the reality that in many households, women are still primarily the default parents and are taking on that second shift at home.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm thinking, I have a lot of friends in Spain. And when it comes to Spain, childcare is so expensive. And I know this is the case in many countries in Europe. So either you pay basically almost a full salary for someone else to take care of your kids, or you do it yourself. And then, since the payment gap and the traditions, of course, women tend to choose to stay home with their kids because otherwise they would work and pay someone else to take care of their kids, but it would be like a zero-sum game in the end.
Yeah,
And of course, that brings on so many different things when you choose to do that. I'm not saying that staying home with your kids is a bad thing, but I think many women don't feel like they have a choice.
absolutely. And I think as we have this conversation, it's really important to separate two things because two things are true here. One is that in many societies, in many households, women are making choices about how much to work and where to work in order to essentially be the social safety net that does not exist in their
Yeah.
country. I live in France where we have pretty abundant, heavily subsidized childcare. People are making different choices than they are in some countries where that infrastructure does not exist. So, one piece of this is how women are choosing to work given the supports that are available to them. And the other piece that goes along with it or beside it are the biases,
Mm,
the assumptions that are made that, okay, that every woman is going to be less committed or less capable or less available for her job once she has kids.
mm. But then when we have kids and we hit these biases, I don't know about you, but isn't it true that many women try to overcompensate to
Yeah.
fill the gap and sort of prove to everyone and everything that they can be counted on?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to answer that in a second, but I want to take a step back first because there's this other dimension to the motherhood penalty that I think will just provide some color and some context as we talk about what women tend to end up doing to try to work their way out of the penalty. And so, what's super interesting as you look at something like the gender pay gap is, at least in the US, they've started to do some really interesting analysis that shows that there is the gender pay gap is completely gone in one area. And that is between men and women without kids. So when researchers start to group people by age, race, education, number of children, what they found is that some groups of women actually out earn men by almost 10%. Now, the rub is that this is only true for a small group, educated women under 30 without kids. So, on the one hand, right, this is amazing. Women are making these huge gains in pay equity. And they're used to being treated equally and on equal footing and having the same opportunities and pay as an equivalent man in their role. And then they have kids. And suddenly, boom, this chasm opens up. And that, I think, kind of sets up this dynamic. Like when you're used to being on equal footing, and then you have a baby, and suddenly you feel like, all right, everyone's looking at me and going like, oh, maybe she can't do the travel. Maybe she's not interested, and maybe she's not capable of doing the hard work anymore. What do we do? Well, we know on the inside that we're fully capable, and we're just as ambitious, we're just as committed in many cases as we always were. And so it sets up this dynamic where women feel like we have to prove our commitment, prove our capability. And that typically happens by overworking, overdoing, putting a lot of extra time and effort and energy into our jobs to show everyone around us that we're still that same go-getter that we were, 9 months ago before the baby arrived, right?
Yeah. And I'm also thinking, now we're talking about like just getting the baby, but everybody who has a baby knows that the baby hopefully grows up and becomes a toddler. And we constantly develop in our parenting, and the challenges are different. So the ones that we come across in the beginning are very different from the other ones when the kids grow up. And of course, everybody knows that parents have this sort of journey in front of them, and so does the employer. Is there any sort of thing you can see on the motherhood penalty as it changes as your kids grow?
That's a really good question. And I have seen some data around this, but I don't have it to hand. And so I wouldn't want to misspeak on this point. Um, I think that is an excellent question. And I'm not sure at what point we start to see that gap starting to close again. But what is clear is that the motherhood penalty, it is pretty much an immediate impact. As soon as women give birth, that's when it's like you get the biggest hit. And it does tend to close a little bit over time, but there is a permanent hit to women's wages and a permanent gap that opens up that, you know, it's very hard then 10 years later for women to be like, okay, now I'm back in and I'm fully caught up and have her wages adjusted to reflect that. That's typically not what happens.
No, exactly, because that's what I'm thinking. Like let's just call it the 10-year gap then. The chasm opens up, and for some people, maybe it closes a little bit by those 10 years. But, well, I don't know, because as I said, I'm not a statistic person, but I would find it very unlikely that you could catch up to the salary increase speed of what a man would do in those 10 years.
Yeah. I think certainly if we're looking at averages, on average, women are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'll speak in US dollars. They're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of their career because of this gap. Now, at the individual level, of course, there are variations. A lot of this depends on your field, how you kind of structure those career pauses. So I don't want to make the case that every single woman is going to experience in the same way and to the same magnitude, but on average, absolutely correct. This is a chasm that opens up. It's significant. It causes major impact financially over the course of our lifetime. And on average, we're not seeing it fully close, even when women step back up in their careers.
That is so depressing, because what I'm thinking as well, when it comes to the penalty and us trying to work harder to close the gap, what happens when we work more at work and put more energy there? I would say on the other side, when you have your family, you will then, when you think more about work and you work more at work, what suffers? Well, I wouldn't say they actually suffer, the kids and the family and all of the things, but we all know that you can't do everything. I know we are all at some point trying to do everything. I will get back to that. But you can't do everything. So then when you put all your energy into work, well, not all, but a lot, I think a lot of people experience a lot of guilt when it comes to your motherhood and being a wife or running the household. Or I'm not saying that you are responsible for the household, but this guilt, I meet a lot of women in my coaching that feel like they're bad moms.
Yep. Yeah. I totally hear you on this. And the way I like to think of it is like, I like to think of it in terms of math. I'm a math geek. I love stats. I love math. So I think about it just in terms of math. Like we've got 24 hours in a given day. And if you're giving 8, 9, or 10 of those to work, for a lot of us, we look at that and we go like, well, this is 8, 9, 10 hours that I'm not giving to my family, not giving to my kids. And even though you might want to be doing a really great job at work and investing that time, I think there's that part of many of us that's conscious of like, these are hours that I'm not spending over here. And then the guilt hits about how we're doing as moms. We see that we're not giving 100% of our time at home. And so then we scramble to do more and more and get more productive at home. And we overwork at home. We try to work our way out of the guilt. Again, this like idea of trying to like prove to ourselves and others that we're actually a good mom, an okay mom. And so then you end up on like this seesaw where you're going and spending a bunch of time at home to try to prove that everything's okay there and you're still a great mom. And then you're highly conscious of all the stuff that's not happening at work. And you start to feel guilty over there. Then you run to the other side of the seesaw, put your effort over there. And then the home stuff is slipping. And so it's this feeling, instead of being balanced, it's like you're constantly on this seesaw that you can never quite get in the quote unquote right place. You're overworking on both sides, depending on the day or the hour.
Yeah. And I would say also mentally, because what I see a lot of people or a lot of women doing is that they overwork mentally. So if they're at work, they're thinking about, oh, I should do this and I need to plan this excursion and I need to do that and pick up the kids and diddle. So you're not focused at work 100%. And then when you come home, you are thinking about work. So you're with your kids, maybe you're cooking, maybe you're playing a game or whatever you're doing, but your mind is traveling over to the work side. And then you're not actually in the zone with your kids either. And I think this mental seesaw, even though you're physically with your family, you can mentally be at work. And I think this is also a completely stressful situation to be in. And I think
Mhm.
it's something that a lot of women and probably men too experience, that you cannot be in the present because your mind is constantly trying to compensate for where you're not at the moment.
Yeah, that struggle to stay present is so big. And I think you very rightly point out the mental drain that occurs as we're trying to switch between our to do lists, our lives, our roles in these two very important jobs, our paid work and our unpaid work that we hold. And it's, we, we could go into like so many different directions because this is so pervasive about how we live and work that, I think though, one of the things that I see happening is as we're struggling to stay present, as we're always kind of fragmented between these two roles, and as we're overworking to try to prove our competence and our excellence in these areas, one of the things that ends up happening is that we drive ourselves into burnout because
Mm,
we reduce the kind of lie that we tell ourselves that we just need to squeeze out any unproductive time. So
mm,
we we squeeze out sleep, we squeeze out time for ourselves, we squeeze out time for exercise, we squeeze out a fun night out with our friends every so often. Basically, all the activities that we know from research help us reset, help us prevent burnout, help us gain and restore energy. Those are the things that we're squeezing out in the attempt to be all things at work and all things at home. And that leads us to running on fumes, which can, if we leave it long enough, will just lead to burnout.
yeah, it's like the perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm I'm also thinking when we're talking now about family life and work life, I think our expectations on our, I don't know, deliverance, because what we do is like we deliver a version of ourselves and our work, both at work and at home. And when we try to, I would say, reach for perfection, because even though we know perfect isn't possible, I talk to so many people that explain this like feeling of never doing enough. There is always something else to be done. But it's like when they talk about it, I can hear that they are reaching for the horizon. They're reaching for perfect. And it's not only in the family life and the work life, because we have so many other buckets, if you will, that we think we need to overperform in, like the perfectionist fantasy that we
Yeah.
have. All of these buckets, you try to reach some kind of perfection, and we try to solve it by producing. And just like you say, what do we do? Yeah, we squeeze out all of the things that can give us some relief, give us some energy, let us recuperate. We squeeze that out. And I think the big issues is probably like the seesaw effect with the work and the home, that thing. But then we have all of these other things that we want to try to get in as well. And we only have 24 hours. And then,
Yeah.
as we talked about in the beginning, we need 9+ hours of sleep. So we don't have that many hours left in a day. What's reasonable? I mean, what are we to do?
Yeah. I want to come back to the point that you made, because I think this is such an important point for your listeners to take away. I think that so many of us have this perfectionistic idea that given our multiple roles, if we could just manage to throw the perfect Instagrammable birthday party for our toddler, with like the gorgeous custom invites and the perfectly set table and everyone, playing at their fun activity with the musician and the magician that you've hired. We think that if we were able to do that, or, if we just got our house in order so that every closet was like perfectly Pinterest organized and beautiful, we think that if we were to achieve those standards, that we would somehow then feel okay about the job that we're doing.
Yeah.
That's the thing that would allow us to finally feel like, "Ooh, I'm doing this well." And that is the kind of fundamental lie that we tell ourselves that ends up making us overwork and leading to then needing to squeeze out the
Mm.
time for the things that actually will restore us.
And I mean, I think we can all see the impossibility in, like, isn't even called impossibility. I don't know. But it's impossible to reach all of these standards. And I think we can all see it, but inside we still try. We still want to. We at least think we want to, or we think we need to. And it's such a dissonance. And I think it's creating so much stress for us.
I 100% agree. What I often say to people is that we need to focus less on how things look to the outside world. We
Mm,
think like, if I look good, or if my kid's party looks good, right? Then I will feel okay. And we have to start with solving for how we want to feel rather than
yeah,
how we want things to look. So if we're trying to solve for making our home feel loving and relaxed and joyful, we can't solve for that by trying to make our household Instagram worthy. We solve for that
oh,
by building in the activities that make people, including ourselves, very importantly ourselves, feel love and joy and relaxation. Because that
yeah,
is what's going to set the tone for us and for our households.
so good. But when it comes to the motherhood penalty and the mom guilt primarily, do you think focusing on how you want to feel in your job and how you want to feel as a mother, is that what we could like send with the listeners that they should focus on? Or do we have any other tips and tricks for how to get around this? Or I mean, it's a social construct, this motherhood penalty. And it's not like we could give you a suggestion like do this and it will go away. But how can we navigate to make it easier for ourselves? I guess that's my question.
Yeah. So I probably digressed a little bit with the talk about feelings, because that's a slightly advanced concept for listeners to start with. So where I want people to start, and I think this is something that everyone can take away and start doing today, is we really need to rethink the level at which we're working. And what I mean by that is like, the tendency when we're trying to prove ourselves, it's to overwork, it's to do all the things, it's to spread ourselves really thin to try to do all the things. And instead, what I really suggest as the way out of this is to start to think about how you can work more strategically and really concretely. What this means is choose your priorities, both at work and at home. And I think people get this in the workplace context really easily. So I'll start there and then we can talk about what that looks like at home. But at work, you probably know that there are some projects that are more important to get over the line than others. And so if you've got 40 hours in a week and you're only devoting 2 to your top priorities, you're probably not going to move the right stuff ahead and you're not going to move it ahead fast enough. So at work, it's like really just pick out the top 3 things that you need to be focused on delivering. And that's where you want to put the bulk of your energy, time, and focus. That's going to require you to pull back from some other areas, but we know at work, like not all deliverables are created equal. Not everything counts for the same. So you really want to focus in on your strategic priorities. But we can do a very similar exercise at home. Like if, for example, one of the things that I talk about, I'm an American, but I live in Paris. One of my big priorities at home is raising conscious and conscientious global citizens. I want my kids to feel at home here, but I also want them to feel at home in my home country in America. And so for me, that means a real priority is celebrating some of the American holidays that don't exist here in France, like Thanksgiving or Halloween. So I make a really big deal about those holidays. And that means that I maybe spend a little bit less time on some other stuff that's not a strategic priority. But I know that if I nail this strategic priority, then I'm doing a good job. Everything else falls into place. I make it a point to go volunteer in my kids' school at Halloween because it's a strategic priority. Then I let go the opportunity to volunteer at the school in the middle of April. I don't feel no guilt about that because I'm hitting my strategic priorities. And I think when we each do that for ourselves, then we're able to put our energy and focus where it's going to make most impact for us and for our families.
That's really, really good. But I'm wondering if you have any suggestions when it comes to like everyday life when you are trying to juggle pickup and laundry and I don't know, all of the things.
So many, so many. Oh my goodness. How long do you have me on here for? Because
Just tell us
we
all the
can go
things.
deep. So uh, I will try not to tell you all the things, or this will be your longest podcast episode ever. But let
It
me
might be anyway.
so let me start with kind of 1 or 2 things that people can do with their everyday to-do list. So one of the things that I like to do is really write down everything that's on the list. And I highlight what's essential for me personally to do and be involved in versus stuff that either might be optional altogether, like maybe it doesn't need to happen at all, or might need to happen but doesn't necessarily require me. So let me give an example of that. I'm in the process of signing my kids up for summer camp. This needs to happen around this time of year. But I personally am not the only person who can do this and take care of this. And so knowing where you need to pull in help, whether it's from others or from outside, that can allow you to really focus on the things on your to-do list that can only be done by you and absolutely require your input and energy. I also think we need to feel free to write our own job descriptions. So, my mother in law believes that having really well ironed everything is essential to the job of running a household. I do not. That's just not part of how I've written my own job description. And so I think the more that we can free ourselves up to be like, I hear that society has handed me this job description, but here's how I'm rewriting it for myself. That gives us incredible freedom to realize that we don't need to do everything that is on someone else's job description. We're not working for them, we're working for ourselves.
And I'm also thinking that I think a lot of women have a job description for themselves that they haven't actually really looked at. Maybe it's time to look at your job description and actually create a job description that works for you and not against you. Because,
So true.
yeah, because if the result you're creating is maybe a super maintained house and all of the things, but you are on the verge of burnout, I wouldn't say that's a functioning role description.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there, which is we need to give ourselves permission to really look at that job description, rethink it, rewrite it, and rewrite it in a way that works for us.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I would say, wrapping up a little bit, because I can see we're close to the hour, that being mindful of this seesaw that we very often find ourselves in, depending on our work and our family life, and see how is it tipping over, and where are you working really hard, and when is it tipping back, so you have to run over to the other side and sort of compensate, and how does it reflect like results in your life, like what happens when you do that, because all change start with awareness. So for me, I always tell my clients and my women that start with awareness. That is the first step to everything. So with Shawna's excellent pinpoint tips, I would just want to add, try to be aware of what you're doing and have a look, because this is, it's not worth it. Even though the motherhood penalty is real, we cannot compensate for it all on our own, because we will pay with burnout in the end. I think many of us will. Or what would you say?
I 100% concur. I would say that the motherhood penalty is real. And if you fall into the trap of trying to outwork it, not only will you end up in burnout, but you will probably end up in the trap of not working at a strategic enough level at work to really show what you're capable of. So I applaud your note to everyone to just be aware of when they're feeling that seesaw and starting to let guilt or let pressure or let that urge to go invest a bunch of energy in another area when they're letting that drive decisions. So important.
So good. Well, I would say we should probably wrap up, because people won't be able to listen for such a long time, even though I know we could go on talking about this forever. But before we hang up, I would want to shout out to everyone listening that if you haven't listened to Shawna's podcast already, The Mental Offload, you should definitely do so, because you have, I think, so many good episodes when it comes to work and life. And if you are listening and you're a woman in your career and you work in corporate, then there is so many things that Shawna can teach you through the podcast. But you also have a new program out, right, Shawna?
Do.
Tell us short about it, because I think it would be interesting for my listeners to know.
So, really briefly, one of the new programs I've released is called Rise. This is really designed for women who are dealing with that intersection of career and family, but who want to be able to invest more bandwidth at work without it collapsing their family life. And so we really work on the three things that help women get ahead without spending oodles of time at work. And that is um, driving great strategic performance, building relationship capital with the people who matter, and developing the executive presence to get ahead. So that's what we do in Rise. It's so much fun.
Oh, that sounds so good. So, with that said, Shawna, thank you so, so much for coming on. I'm sure we will have you on shortly again to talk about something else.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. Even though it's a serious topic, I just loved having this conversation with you. And I hope that everyone who is listening um, gets some great takeaways for how they can work around the motherhood penalty.
So good. Thank you so much, Shawna. And until next time, everybody needs to listen to the Mental Offload podcast and follow you on Instagram, the Mental Offload, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mental_offload. And you can also come connect with me on LinkedIn. I share a bunch of stuff there. Shawna Samuel on LinkedIn. I love meeting members of the community over on LinkedIn. So come join me there.
So good. Thank you so much, Shawna. And I'll see you later.
Thanks so much, Anna.
Bye!
Bye.
Så där har vi det. Lite längre än vanligt, eller hur? Men förhoppningsvis mycket som du kan ta med dig så att du kan bli medveten om hur det här påverkar dig i ditt liv, om det nu är så att du har barn. Och är det så att du inte har barn, bli inte avskräckt. Men jag tycker att det är viktigt att lyfta fram sådana här saker som vi faktiskt alla ser, men nu också faktiskt har bevis på att det finns och att det inte bara är i våra hjärnor eller någonting som vi inbillar oss. Och det enda sättet för oss att förändra det här, det är att först och främst bli medvetna om hur vi själva agerar i våra liv. Sen är det här ett strukturellt problem och vi kan inte ändra det på egen hand. Men du kan ändra din livssituation och din inställning jättemycket genom att faktiskt välja själv och använda de här tipsen. Så det hoppas jag att du gör. Och sen så hoppas jag såklart att vi hörs nästa vecka.